Odin is called the All-Father, All-Father. I know that I hung from a branch of that windswept tree for 9 long nights, marked by a spear and dedicated to Odin, myself to myself on that tree, whose roots go down to where no men know. They did not feed me nor give me drink. I looked down, searching. I took the runes, screaming, I took them, and from there I returned. If that is the case as well, Tyr would be the head of the Old Norse pantheon, and Odin would be where Tyr is now. And that may be because if you think what's happening 2,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago in Northern Europe, Rome, the Roman Empire was starting to build, Celtic tribes, there's a lot of war going on there. So you can see Zeus taking over the storm god role. And what you would also find is a storm god was often very much a warrior god as well. In some of the very early myths, so in Proto-Indo-Europeans, there's a myth around what we call the cattle raiding myth. You'll see that in Persian mythology, Indo-Iranian mythology, with Andrew Prusa, him of the Vedic. That creation myth of the Indo-Europeans is reflected everywhere between us. Chinese Taoist to a degree. So we wrote about that. Bruce Lincoln wrote about that in his.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true Gnosis. And I'm joined once again by Crecganford, and we're getting back into the Indo-European mythology. And the Sky Father is the most interesting, fascinating topic to me because it affects every religion on the planet in some way, shape, or form. There's some sort of Sky Father. There's Jupiter. There's Zeus, Yahweh, whatever. And there's an origin for this. This Sky Father has an origin. And a lot of times people get him mixed up with Odin or Thor, or maybe they think there's some sort of connection between the three. So why does that seem to be the common misconception, and what is the difference?
Wow, big questions and great questions, Neil. Well, let's start by talking about the Sky Father and who he is and how he evolved, so people really work out what we're talking about here. So the Sky Father is a translation from the Proto-Indo-European of a name called Zeus Futter, which is Zeus meaning God and Futter father. So but they actually know as Godfather, and he was considered the overarching ruler of the world. Okay, so responsible for everything. And so if you were to make a sacrifice to someone, that would be the person you would usually make it to. He's the most important. And the Sky Father, as an aside, would also have a partner who would turn out to be the Earth Mother, or someone we currently call today Mother Nature, in effect. That's why Mother Nature is such as a partner to the Sky Father. So the Sky Father, we know this name because we can see language evolve, and it goes into the Vedic culture in India. It goes across, and we see it, as you've talked about, in Greek and Roman mythology as well, where in Greece we know him as Zeus, the Des to Zeus, and then it goes into Jupiter. Now, what some people don't necessarily realize is what you mentioned about Yahweh in particular, but in terms of Thor as well, people associate those gods, those originals, often with storm gods. And you think, well, storm gods are in the sky, so why aren't they the Sky Father? Is that why they're the Sky Father? And there's be some mix there. And I think it's a bit of both. So the original name for the thunder god of the Proto-Indo-Europeans was Percunus, and that turned into Perun in Northern Europe and changed into a number of other names we can discuss later on. But it certainly didn't evolve into Thor, which is why there's a bit of a twist. And equally, the Old Norse also had a god called Tyr, and Tyr is cognate with Zeus and Zeus. So people think, so there's a god called Tyr. Isn't he the Sky Father? But again, we can talk about that in a second. But if we go back to gods like Zeus and Percunus, so you actually find in very early Greek mythology, there was a god called Zeus Percunus. It wasn't just called Zeus. So you can see Zeus taking over the storm god role. And what you'll also find is a storm god was often very much a warrior god as well. So you tended to give tributes to that warrior god if you go into battle. And we see that in some of the very early myths. So in Proto-Indo-Europeans, there's a myth around what we call the cattle raiding myth. It's a very important myth. And it is where the enemy of the Proto-Indo-Europeans had cattle. And the Proto-Indo-Europeans thought those cattle were stolen, and it's their right to have the cattle because cattle were made by Zeus Putter for them. So if anybody else had them, that was wrong. So they would give worship to the storm god, the Percunus here, and then they'd go off, get their cattle, and come back and sacrifice those to their Putter. But they would actually make the initial sacrifice before they went off to the storm god to get strength. Wow. And that cattle raiding myth then goes off into other strange stuff, such as that got rewritten in the Vedic culture as rather than raiding cattle and attacking a serpent who went to steal the cattle and come back, the cattle got renamed into females who give milk, because that's how it was translated in the poetry, and females who gave milk eventually turned into queens and princesses. And so the cattle raiding myth turned into slaying a dragon and rescuing a princess myth.
Wow.
So that's a sort of a slight off topic, but quite interesting.
Yeah, no,
how these myths are in our stories today. But yeah, we see this storm god and there's probably two of the key gods flow into Europe. Sometimes the storm god gets absorbed, like the warrior god gets absorbed by the Zeus Putter, and sometimes he doesn't. And so in Greek and Roman mythology, you actually sometimes see Zeus and Jupiter holding thunderbolts. And where they're holding thunderbolts, that's a recognition that god has taken over the storm god power of thunder and lightning. So hopefully, you may have seen imagery of Jupiter holding a lightning bolt, and that's where he's known as, in effect, the primary god, Optimus Maximus, in effect, as a god. But when this god or these gods hit the northwestern Europe, things change a bit. So, like most traditional religions or pre-Christian religions, there isn't much written down, certainly European-wise. So we don't know really what was happening. There isn't too much evidence in archaeology of that. But what we do know is the gods' names, and we have that within some manuscripts, which turned into books which were called the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda. And I believe you've read those recently. You told me about those. Yep. And they're basically the two key sources we have of information. There are some others, but they're the key ones. And they give us ideas of what gods were doing and the like. And what we find is that Zeus, Putter, and Percunus have disappeared in this pantheon. The Old Norse pantheon, you have Odin and you have Thor. So Odin is considered the primary god, is the god that the kings worship. In effect, he's considered the ruler of the pantheon. We have Thor, who's taken on the storm god, warrior god role, and not strictly so, but that sort of thing. And then we have Freyr, who's taken on this sort of the agricultural fertility type role. So I have those three gods, and none of those actually align well with the Indo-European pantheon names. And we've got to think, well, what has gone on there? Because that doesn't make sense, because they sort of aligned everywhere else. So what's gone on? And to be honest, we don't really know what's gone on, but we do see the shift. And one of those reasons we see the shift is for the god called Tyr. So the god called Tyr, who is often seen as a god of justice and a war type god. Tyr had his hand bitten off by a wolf who we know as Fenrir. Fenrir is a giant wolf who at the end of the world. So when Ragnarok happens, which is the end of the world myth in Old Norse mythology, the Fenrir goes and eats Odin. As part of the pre-mythology that Fenrir bites off Tyr's hand, and that's how we know him. It's famous. So any imagery of Tyr, he's only got one hand and a sword, but his name, as I said earlier, is cognate with Zeus. So you would think, so he must be maybe a evolution of the Skyfather. But then if he was an evolution of Skyfather, why isn't he at that position in the pantheon? What's happened? Has something happened to knock him down? Well, if he is that old, and he does have an old name, then where was Odin at the time Tyr was sort of there, like at a high level in the pantheon, if he was? And the fact is that we don't actually have any archaeological record of Odin appearing before the start of the first millennium. And Woden as well before that. So as a god, as a personified god, there really is very little evidence to say Woden or Odin existed more than 2,000 years ago.
Wow.
So he's a potentially relatively new god on the scene. So it could be that the evolution of Odin coincided with the sort of the evolution or the relegation, I'd say, of Tyr.
Can I jump in for a second?
Yeah, sure.
Because I think this is relative, but I'm not to cut you off. This is all
questions.
Super fascinating. Now, if you go to the old Greek myths, like going back to like Hesiod, the oldest like not the oldest, but like older than like the Hellenistic era.
Yes.
So we're going back pretty far.
So 500 BCE sort of stuff.
Yeah. So Hesiod talks about the succession of chaos, and then I think it goes from chaos to Aranos, which means sky. So Aranos could be the sky father, and then he gets taken over by Saturn or Kronos, depending on which language you're going with, and then Saturn gets taken over and killed by Zeus. So even in the Greek myths, Zeus is not the sky father originally; it's Aranos. Now my question is this where the mix-up happens?
That's interesting because but you see, you still have Jupiter and Zeus there as sky father names linked,
right?
So and Skyfather was the head of the Proto-Indo-European pantheon. So unless that is a hint at, as you say, an older pantheon that has dissolved.
That's what I'm saying. Maybe there's some sort of mix-up happening in the shuffle when these gods are being turned over into new gods. And that's why you think one equates to the other, but it doesn't. And that's where people get confused, because after these myths get separated from language to language, there's going to be changes. And after those changes are made, you can't see you can't see this
exactly.
equals this. And that's
a lack of record. But then, if that is the case as well, Tyr would be the head of the Old Norse pantheon, and Odin would be where Tyr is now. But
right.
So there's been an additional change.
Yeah,
because Tyr is and that may be because if you think what's happening 2,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago in Northern Europe, Rome, the Roman Empire was starting to build. The Celtic tribes were becoming sort of restless with the Roman pushing. There's a lot of war going on that wasn't actually going on before. There was always inter-tribal conflict, but there wasn't a war, an empire pushing. And to me, I think part of that helps to contribute towards needing a different god. Why isn't Tyr helping us? The Roman Empire is slowly taking over like the Germanic lands. And also you then get in effect conscription, or not conscriptions, you'll get warriors from the Scandinavian countries working for the Romans, mercenaries in effect, and they were working for the Romans. They will get insight into the other religions, and then when they go back to their country, some of what they learn may influence them. And so we just sort of see a part of this in Mercury and Hermes when compared to Odin, because So Mercury is a name that is compared to Odin by Tacitus in his Germania book,
and Herodotus.
and Herodotus.
And Herodotus is way before Tacitus. He's 500 years before Tacitus. So
when did Herodotus actually say that specifically? Does he actually say it specifically of Odin or of Luke?
I'll tell you exactly what Herodotus says. Okay. Herodotus says that the people in Germany, he calls them the Scythians, they worship our Mercury as their sovereign god. So he doesn't say Odin at all. He doesn't mention Odin. He doesn't even mention the name. What he does is he says the way we look at Mercury as like the messenger of Zeus or Jupiter, they look at Mercury as the king of the gods.
See, and that is interesting.
That's all the information he gives.
Because that would suggest Odin is more than 2,000 years old, 2,500 years old, which is possible. But Woden was more of a psycho, and he certainly wasn't personified then. So Proto-Indo-European belief.
And you got to remember too that Herodotus is not all-knowing. He could be getting some things wrong. He could be confusing two things and putting them into one, and just saying, "Oh, that's Mercury." So we don't know for sure how in depth of the study he was doing, but that's all he gives us.
It's very tantalizing, though, to think that.
Yeah,
I just don't feel that the personification of gods you had in Greece and Rome didn't apply to the Germanic tribes. He took probably 2,000 years ago. They only started to think about being personified. Before then, there were spirits. There was no real figurative representations of any of the gods.
Right.
So to say that god was Mercury would suggest someone had an image of the god that they could visualize to do a comparison, because you'd imagine most visualization or most comparison would be based on something visual, because that's the easiest thing to compare, when certainly there's a language barrier between the two cultures making that comparison.
It's a good point.
Yeah.
And
so
a lot of people go right to astrotheology. They think of astrotheology because they're thinking Mercury, they think of a planet. But you got to realize that these planets didn't get assigned these gods' names till later on. So that's not, you can't just say, oh, they're both identifying the planet Mercury as the same god. You can't do that, because that doesn't happen until later.
Exactly.
I used to make that mistake all the time. But
yeah. That is tantalizing. Yes. Okay. So we have this. So there is this mix. So also what we see at this time, when it looks like Tyr is dropping and Odin is arising about 2,000 years ago or so, we also see that Hercules, the storm god, his name changes through Europe. He turns into Tantalus in the Celtic pantheon, and within Central Europe, he's known as Fusion. So Perkinus it means something to do with sort of an oak tree or lightning striking an oak tree. It has that reference, where it turns into Fusion in Germany, which really means trees on a mountaintop. So you see this the cognate, but there's an evolution in what this means. But when you go into the Old Norse pantheon in Scandinavia, Fusion is a son of Thor, and Thor means thunder. So what you suddenly got is that you've certainly now got a different god who's responsible for what people think is a storm god, and he's apparently the father of the god that is cognate with the original storm god. But what is even more interesting is that Thor isn't a storm god. Even though he carries Mjolnir, which means lightning, and his name means thunder, Thor is actually a sky god. Thor is the sky father. And we can say that because he was, without doubt, the most popular god in the Nordic countries. Okay, so he was pretty much worshipped by everyone, where Odin, whilst he may be considered the head of the pantheon, he was really only worshipped by royalty or those high up in the class system. And that's why he tends to be written about, because the people who can afford to write about him would write about the gods they like rather than the popular gods. And so if that is the case, and Thor is the sky father because he is sort of all-seeing and rise to the sky, and actually does nothing with thunder or lightning in any of the Eddas, not one word you would have read in the poetical prose Edda said Thor did something with lightning or did something with thunder. Nothing. If that's the case, then who is Odin? because Odin then can't be the Sky Father. Thor is the Sky Father.
Yeah, that's such a confused. It's so. Do you have the answer to that? Do you
I
think
can tell you my
you're
ideas on this. So,
Yeah.
because no one knows, there is no consensus. But my view is based on the term Allfather. So, within the Prose Edda, Odin is called the Allfather
Right.
many times. Well, he isn't actually called the Allfather; he's called Allfather, which means, well, according to Jackson Crawford, Dr. Jackson Crawford, who has his own great YouTube channel on Old Norse mythology, and he's a philologist, so he understands language probably better than I do. His belief is that Ulfadura is actually, whilst it's not specified within any Old Norse language you've got, in Old English it means to put in order, father. So, and because Old English is very similar to Old Norse, almost identical, he believes that Ulfadura is to put in order. So rather than Odin the Allfather, it's Odin the All-Orderer. And so
Wow.
when Odin is called in the Eddas Father of the Slain, he thinks it means Order of the Slain, and things like that. So,
Wow.
and if you look at that, then that means he isn't the Allfather. However, if you then look at where Odin fits in Old Norse mythology, you see that Odin is the god who kills Ymir. Okay, and Ymir means twin and is representative of Yemo. And the very first Proto-Indo-European story I tell, the creation myth, it has Manus and Yemo as the very first two primordial beings. And Manus kills Yemo, so Manus man kills Yemo the twin, and from his body creates the world and creates the people. And that's the basic creation myth that, again, affects many religions around the world. So in Old Norse, Odin is the god with his brothers who kills Ymir to create the world. And in some stories, so in the Prose Edda, you see Odin with his brothers then create man. So what you actually see is Odin has been placed deliberately in the Old Norse myth, replacing Manus, the first man.
Ooh, interesting.
So you have that. So in effect, they've placed Odin as the primordial being, even though Odin has a mother and father and has a grandfather. So we see this.
So Odin is sort of, and I'm going with Greek philosophy language, right?
Yes, that's one thing. Yes,
I'm applying Greek philosophy to Norse mythology right now. But check this out.
See if it fits. Yeah.
This will be funny, right? Odin is like their logos. He's their. They're putting Odin into situations as needed, and applying him to whatever sort of deeds or righteousness or good things they want to use as an example to follow by.
Yeah, although it's more than that, you see, because gods in Proto-Indo-European, they were examples. You lived your life to be as good as the god, so you reached immortality. But Odin was even more than that, because Odin was a real character who affected people's lives. That was mythology. Odin would always turn up in his hat and his cloak, with one eye, and everybody was wonder who this chap is, because he always was so much in disguise despite wearing the same clothes that no one recognised him. But he would, interfere in people's lives, in wars, in got women pregnant, all sorts of things. It's just like Zeusness about him in some respects. So he's even more than that. But he was deliberately placed in that mythology right there now. And if you think that's interesting, and then if you take this further, and I actually haven't written about this anywhere, but I think it's true, is that Yemo, because he is the one that the twin figure is the one that is sacrificed to create the world, he is willingly sacrificed. He decides, I want to die to make the world a better place. I think Yemo or the Ymir figure represents death. And so there's some representation here of Odin as the first man in the living, and Yemo representing the death And you can apply that then to Roman, Greek, and Proto-Indo-European
Well,
mythology.
yeah, because it echoes throughout these other myths. You have Romulus and Remus. Remus dies early on. They can't they're arguing over which pill to use. One of them has to go. Remus goes. Romulus is the savior. And then, but also it echoes in Cain and Abel as well. Cain and Abel, you have both these twin brothers. One of them's giving an offering, it's rejected. The other one, and he kills his brother, but it's not the same. But you could see there's sort of an echo, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
a bit of an echo, yeah. And you'll see that in Persian mythology, Iranian, Indo-Iranian mythology, with Andrew Prusa, the Vedic. Yeah, that creation myth of the Indo-Europeans is reflected everywhere with the twins. It is, yeah. You
Yeah,
even see it in Chinese Taoist to a degree. So we wrote about that. Bruce Lincoln wrote about that in his creation myth paper.
I
But yeah,
wonder. Do you think that there's now we're sort of steering off. We'll go. Get back to the
we'll
Skyfather in
get
a
back
second.
there.
But let me ask you this real quick. Do you think um, this twin motif maybe has to do with nations that are splitting apart? Like you have, let's say, you have the Yamana culture, is that how you say it? Yamna
Mhm.
culture,
Yeah,
and they
yeah,
start to get bigger and bigger over time, and then they split off into two nations. Do you think this is sort of that? Maybe that's what that means, or no?
no. I
Okay,
just think there's a thing about twins, they which are mysterious. Obviously, if you're in a culture and you don't necessarily understand how birth works, because it's only understanding pregnancy is a relatively modern thing. People didn't necessarily quite get
right.
the time for impregnating someone to give birth, how long that really was. So no, I think it's the fact that you have two babies and look identical. That's the thing. And you see that creation myth then developing what we call the divine twin myths. And the divine twins tend to be one of the few sets of gods we know about from the Proto-Indo-European pantheon with sort of certainty. And that turned into Castor and Pollux of the Romans and Hengist and Horsa of the Germanic tribes. And they're quite interesting. So those twins turned out to be representatives of the class system. So there's a tripartite class system within Indo-European culture where you have the priest, the warrior, and the commoner, or the food maker, okay, and the king, and people tend to fit in those classes. And the divine twins, one of them represented the warrior, and one of them represented the commoner. And so you'll find in most divine twin myths, the commoner divine twin eventually disappears from the myth, and we see that in Castor and Pollux, where I think it is Castor is the commoner. He disappears, where um, and Pollux turns out to be the patriot of the Roman Guard. And in Hengist and Horsa disappears, and Hengist turns into the main warrior who takes over England in effect, or fights in
Yep.
England. So we see that, and the reason for that is quite interesting. So just go back to Yemo, where he's killed and creates the world. Part of Yemo is used to build people. And what happens is to build a king, Manus uses every part of Yemo's body. Squash it together remains a little man, and that's the king. And he's the king because he consists of the whole of Yemo. But from Yemo's head, he made the priest. From Yemo's torso, he made the warrior. And from Yemo's legs, he made the commoner. And so the king, because he's made of all parts, he's able to make food like a commoner, or be give like the commoner. He can fight like the warrior, and he can understand priestly rights like the priest. And that's why you have this system. And
That's
so it all
fascinating.
fits together quite nicely like that.
And then you can sort of see that echoing in the caste system in India.
Absolutely, very much so,
Yeah.
very much so.
So
So
so let's go back to the Skyfather thing. And
mhm.
this I love when you go off on these tangents. It's just fun. I'm sure people are gonna enjoy it too. But okay, so Odin is famous. Everyone knows that the nine Odin hangs himself on a right tree for 9 days. What is this all about? What is the meaning of this?
Okay, let me ask you a question, because every time I'm interviewed by someone with significant uh, Abrahamic sort of scholarly background, they ask me this question. So, what do you think it is about that you like? Because then I can
Well,
approach it some way. Or
because when you come from a background of Judeo Christianity, the sacrifice theme is obviously in the forefront. Whether you're a Jew and you think that the nation of Israel is the suffering servant, the Holocaust happened in history. You got the Jews going to Babylon, Or in Christianity, it's Jesus who gets crucified for 3 days, and his death brings salvation for everyone else. Now, when you hear about Odin sacrificing himself for the world for 9 days, hanging on a tree, the imagery is like screaming at you. This is another
analogy or metamorphosis of the crucifixion method of the
right.
gospel. Okay, so right, do you? I'll give you the. I can give you a 1 minute summary, or I can give you. I'll do the deep dive. So we do the deep dive.
Do the
So
deep dive.
so the what we're talking about here is stanzas 138 and 139 of a poem called the Havamal. Okay, now the Havamal is meant to represent, or Havamal means sort of the words of the wise one. Okay, and it's taken, the title's taken from the first line of the very last stanza, the very last sort of verse of that poem, where it's sort of like, these are the words of the wise one. So, but when you look at the poem, you actually see the poem's made of a number of parts. So it's almost like an anthology of words that people think Odin spoke, all clumped together into one poem. And it's turned out that is now the longest poem we know in Old Norse, as well as probably the most contentious in terms of what's going on. And whatever I tell you now, there will be people who disagree because there's been so much written about this. I mean, it's very analogous to the New Testament, and what's actually was written or what, and it gets that deep. Now, what you have to bear in mind is the words you have told me about that poem in terms of sacrifice and tree and hanging 9 days. That is based on a translation. Okay, and translations can go wrong, and translations can be wrong if you're translating from a facsimile of an orally told story that has been written down in such shorthand that it only contains the first and last letter of many words to save space, and it has no punctuation. And that's a lot of the Edda is like, the Codex Regius, which is the manuscript from which the Poetic Edda is written, because space was crucial, because it was written by Christian. The Poetic Edda is probably written by Christian monks or some scholars, and rather than writing Christian stuff, which was more important, they have to save space when writing pagan sort of things. But they did, and as I say, you have this issue where not all words are written. So you've got this. They've written down this poem which may have errors in, either deliberate or not, and then people have to translate what's written down, and there can be differences in that. So where do we start now? So the poem itself, and I guess I can read it out. So people really know what these two verses are.
Yeah.
Okay, so it goes, I know that I hung from a branch of that windswept tree for 9 long nights, marked by a spear and dedicated to Odin, myself to myself on that tree, whose roots go down to where no men know. They did not feed me nor give me drink. I looked down, searching. I took the runes, screaming, I took them, and from there I returned. So that's my own sort of contemporary English translation, but that's basically what that is. And that's, so anybody hears that thinks, there's Odin hanging on a tree, he's been marked by a spear. Again, you probably think, that's reminiscence of some Christian story you may have heard. And then, and there's this sacrifice motif around that. He doesn't eat or drink as well. So he's undergoing a lot of turmoil. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's start, because this can go really deep now. So the first line I know that I hung, everybody's in agreement with. There is some hanging going on. But when he says from a branch of that tree, often a windswept tree or windy tree, the word tree isn't necessarily the word tree. So it's actually mithra, I think, in Old Norse, which strictly speaking as a gloss, so as a known term, means gallows.
Oh, wow.
Gallows. Now that is interesting for many reasons we're about to get into a bit later on in the poem. But you hang from gallows, and it's a well sort of described thing that people swing from the gallows and swing from the tree or wherever they're hanging from. So you get this. So we think, there is a tree there, but it may be gallows. And people think, well, what tree is it? Why is there a tree? And people often associate that tree with the world tree of Old Norse mythology, which is often people called the Yggdrasil. And this is a tree that is meant to connect all the realms together. And has roots down into various realms as well, where the Nithogger serpents lay and the Norns carved the future of people and their fate. So it's a well-known tree. So people think, oh, he must be hanging from that tree. Now, the next bit for 9 long nights, that is interesting. For 9 is a very important number in Old Norse mythology. It's a magical number.
Mm.
So he could have just been there for 9 nights, okay? Because we measured, things were measured in nights back then. We didn't measure daytime, we measured things as nights pass. But because 9 is magical, it is assumed that over 9 nights, a transformation may be happening. So they sort of suggesting this is a magical length of time, so something must be happening each night. And where some scholars think it's actually 9 long nights, they actually think that may be, and each night is analogous to a month. And so that's 9 months of transformation. And that may then reflect a birth.
Right.
And there are some scholars who then think
that is deep, because now you got creation and death in the same image.
Oh, things get even more twisted. I tell you, this is probably going to upset many people who think they know Norse mythology. And there are some scholars who think the next 2 stanzas are then talking about Odin's birth. There's been some work done on that. I'm not so sure of that, but I think it is 9 nights rather than 9 months. Because how does someone survive 9 months hanging? 9 nights you could probably get, but 9 months, that's a bit.
Isn't there a story of how Odin is born somewhere else though?
Yeah. So the creation myth says that Odin is fathered by Bor and Besla. So Besla is a giantess. Bor is the son of Uri, who's the first god.
So this would be. So by saying this would be his birth, what are they saying by that? What do they mean by that?
Well, birth of what is he? Is it because it's magic? It's transforming, or rebirth. Or is he giving something? And that's quite interesting because when we talk about sacrifice, this may not be a sacrifice, and I'll get to that in a minute as well. So we know he's hanging potentially from a tree, maybe gallows, for probably 9 nights for some transformation, and then it says he's marked by a spear, or some say he's sort of stabbed by a spear or something, but there's certainly something involving a spear, okay, which people again analogize with Jesus on the cross.
Longinus, spear of Longinus.
Yeah. So what we have here, though, is that there are a number of occasions in Old Norse mythology where Odin, where like when Njord dies, Njord is the actual. He's got a number of. Just comes up twice as a man and a woman, but he's a god. And when he dies, Odin marks him with a spear, and it is akin to a death ritual to be marked by a spear when you die. And that says that Odin owns you. And so the marked by a spear suggests the person hanging is now owned by Odin. Okay. And so the next part, I call it "and dedicated to Odin." Sometimes that's translated as "given to Odin." I think dedicated it makes sense because he's being marked by the spear, and Odin is saying, "You are mine." Okay, so you have this. So it seems like you're hanging from this tree or this gallows for 9 nights. You've been marked by Odin, and you're dedicating yourself to him for that. And what it says is "myself to myself." Now, people often think when he says "myself to myself," that must mean Odin. But actually, if you think about it, there's nothing in that poem that says this is Odin doing this. All it's saying is saying, my boss being dedicated to Odin, myself to myself, is because he's on a this is possibly on the Yggdrasil, this world tree, that and he's got the runes that it must be Odin. But there's actually that isn't 100% sure. This could just be a description of something happening to someone. Okay, but we'll get to that again in a minute as well. And so at the end of the first stanza, like 138, he then says where the roots go down where no one knows, and that, to me, that is the big thing that suggests he's actually on a tree, because gallows wouldn't have roots, and when they go down where no one knows, again, that is a sort of a couplet used in Old Norse mythology and other poems to show they're talking about the Yggdrasil, the world tree. Okay. So it's almost certainly a tree he's hanging from, and with the description like that, it's almost probably the Yggdrasil. However, the Yggdrasil, and you're probably familiar with that name because you read the Eddas.
Oh, yeah.
The Yggdrasil may not be the name of the world tree.
You're blowing my mind right now. So, what's going on with this?
And because of that, it may not mean that this is, again, the world tree, or even that. And now the reason for that, and this is quite complicated, so no one knows for sure, but this makes sense, is that Yggdrasil doesn't stand right in the way it's written. It doesn't make sense, literary sense. So what it probably comes from is two separate words, Ig and Drsils. Okay. And now Ig is an Old Norse term which means sort of it's sort of a mutation from the word Ug or Urga, which is a name for Odin, which means awesome or awe. So Ig mean Odin, and Drsil, there's many etymologies from there, but the one I most like is the one from Old Danish, which states that it is an untamed creature that has overcome hardship. So Yggdrasil is Odin's untamed creature that has overcome hardship, and that creature is Sleipnir, Odin's horse.
Wow.
So Yggdrasil is often seen as meaning Odin's horse.
Interesting.
But it doesn't. Oh, it doesn't. We only just opened this door. So in Old Norse, you also had kennings. So kennings are like similes or metaphors. So a raven in Old Norse poetry would sometimes be called the gull of the battlefield. They wouldn't call it a raven; they'd call it something else, poetic. And that's because Old Norse poetry is all about alliteration rather than rhyming. So they often created these kennings to allow alliteration to continue. Because the real word you wanted to use wouldn't fit.
Right.
So you have Odin's, in effect, Odin's horse, but that was often used as kenning for gallows. So in effect, the thing you hang from. So you're a bit weird. And so why is that? Well, because what probably happened is that Yggdrasil was often actually called Asker Yggdrasil. So there was an Asker before, which means ash, or an ash tree. So we see in some Old Norse poetry Asker Yggdrasil, and I think it might be stanza 18 of the Volaspol, where it actually says like, this is the ash that is the Yggdrasil. It has that synonym in there. So, and what we see is, why is there sort of the ash of Odin's horse? And what seems to have happened is there seems to have been some poetic simplification gone in, where people got fed up saying, in effect, Asker Yggdrasil, and just called it Yggdrasil. So the ash tree became known as Yggdrasil. Okay. And you think, well, that's unlikely, but it isn't, because you see this simplification happening all the time. And I'll tell you an interesting piece of simplification. So the wolf Fenrir we talked about earlier, who bit off Tyr's hand. Okay. Within Old Norse poetry, you see terms like Fenrir's brood and Fenrir's wolf. But what people don't realize is that back in Saxo Grammaticus's time, so sort of so a couple hundred, well, maybe 100 years before the Poetic Eddas were written, Saxo wrote that Loki's had an alternative name, and he was known for living in caves and being a fen dweller. And another name for a fen dweller in Old Norse is Fenrir. So Loki's name was Fenrir, and what we see is that when people talk about Fenrir's wolf, they're saying Loki's wolf. But poetic simplification gets rid of Loki, and the wolf ends up being called Fenrir.
So okay, so I get that. That's interesting, by the way. So how does that? Okay, so now we go back to the tree thing.
Okay, so yeah, so you got this ash. So, but
Sure.
what is interesting is this ash tree Yggdrasil, so ash tree of Odin's horse, which turns into Yggdrasil. Actually, there is some academic belief that Odin was actually a treeman, and that means he was made from a tree, much as man was made from a tree.
What?
And there is some
This is like Adonis almost.
So what we have,
Adonis. Oh shoot! I wonder if there's a cognate there.
So, well, I'll tell you the story. So what we have is talk within the Homerall. There's talk of tree men, like you should dress a tree because it literally says you should dress a tree man. Because
my mind just got blown away for a second. Do you think there's the name Adonai, which is a Semitic name for God? Do you think that has some sort of connection with Odin, or no?
No, because Odin doesn't come from Odin.
Right.
Odin comes from Woden, and Woden.
But what if they're
that was?
But what if they're going the other way around? What if they're
maybe I don't. I'm not so familiar with Greek and etymology isn't my.
Might be a stretch, but it's
subject.
just like But the reason why I went in that direction is because Adonis is born from a tree.
Yes.
So Adonis is a really very important.
But that motif of being born from a tree may be the thing that has carried on.
And so, so is this an agricultural thing? Is this like a springtime birth?
Well, it doesn't talk. Well, what it talks about is, so you've got the three men in the Hovermore mentioned, but you also get in the Voluspa and within the Prose Edda, I think it's the Gallifinian, the story of Odin and his brothers, or Odin and Honia and Luthor, turning trees into man. So there's a thing there, and the tree they turn into man is a asker and an embler. No one really sure what an embler is. They might think it's an elm tree, but the askers, they're the ash tree. So Odin turns an ash tree into man. But so if you then take that sort of mythology back into Asker Yggdrasil, does Asker Yggdrasil not mean ash tree of Odin's horse? But is Asker Yggdrasil again a kenning of Odin? Because Odin, if he came from an ash tree, that could be a kenning for Odin Yggdrasil. And so that's been considered by people like Lieberman and even I was talking about Crawford. They both feel that that's probably, out of all the possibilities, probably the strongest one that sits. That originally the Odin's horse, or maybe even the world tree was really called Odin's Yggdrasil, changed to Asker Yggdrasil for kenning, and Asker's dropped and you just get left with Yggdrasil. But either way, Yggdrasil may not be the name of the world tree, because we actually see the world tree named in other poems differently. And it's named Lerthr and Miamithr in two separate poems. Lerthr is, I think, in Grimnismore. And Lerthr means learned or learned, and Mimir is named after Mimir as well, like knowledge and prophecy. So it's like a prophecy tree or a knowledge tree. And that to me is a far better name for the world tree than Yggdrasil, Odin's horse.
The tree of knowledge.
Tree of knowledge or tree of prophecy.
Wow.
And it's possibly that the Yggdrasil should have been called that and has been lost again through poetic simplification and evolution of stories and the like.
So so with all that being said,
Ed, we don't know if Odin is actually hanging from the Yggdrasil here, and if he was hanging from the Yggdrasil, is the Yggdrasil actually what we think it means?
Right.
So we don't even know what it's hanging from, is what we're saying.
But you mentioned a horse. You mentioned hanging from a horse.
Drasil. Drasil means is Odin's horse, which is another name for Sleipnir.
Because the reason why this is significant is because you go back to the Proto-Indo-European culture, they like to bury the kings or whoever, the nobles would bury themselves with their horses.
Very important horses, yeah, because Odin's horse had 8 legs, not 4, so it was a super horse. Oh, and it was actually the child of Loki. It was one of Loki's children.
Wow.
And Loki gave birth to Sleipnir.
So let's play this tape out. If this is, let's go with the horse thing.
Okay.
Now what does the myth translate to?
Well, so now it's like, is it almost certainly has to be Odin if you think it's the horse, and Odin is hanging on to his horse, marked for death. There's still this ritual going on, but then it doesn't make sense for the ritual, because the next stanza, the next part of the verse says, "I don't eat and I don't drink," and so you've got this man who's been pierced by a spear, hanging for 9 nights, not eating or not drinking. In effect, there's some sort of sacrifice going on, as you pointed out. It feels like there's sacrifice going on, and then he finds the runes. So the runes actually mean secret, or is like esoteric knowledge. So going through this pain, he receives. So in effect, if this is a sacrifice, the gift he's getting back from the sacrifice is this knowledge. Okay, and he says he gets this knowledge, and then he returns. So i.e., he comes out of this process. But so there's a couple of things we also need to know about. If this was a sacrifice, there'd be someone who is doing the sacrifice, the person being sacrificed, and the gift being given, as well as the gift you return. And the fact is that the sacrificer and the sacrificee and the gift are all Odin, and that doesn't quite make sense. But if this is a ritual, and more importantly, an initiation ritual, which are well documented, then the sacrificer and the sacrificee can be the same person. And the gift of Odin, that's who he's giving to get that gift. That makes sense. So this probably isn't a sacrificial ritual as such. It is an initiation ritual. And this, I mean, bear in mind, the Abrahamic religions did not have a monopoly on these kind of rituals, like with Jesus on the cross. These were across the Eurasiatic continent, and we see these happening in shamanistic cultures, and we see this happening specifically in Old Norse cultures. So we see this is probably an initiation ritual and an initiation of Odin getting hold of that esoteric knowledge. And what has probably happened is, the way this tends to happen is that, I mean, you see it in the Voluspa, which is the first poem of the Poetic Edda. When for Odin to find out all his knowledge, he raises a seeress from the dead, and asks her what happened. He has this sort of question and answer session with her. And what happens is, you normally make a sacrifice, and a woman, so remember the opposite sex, from the dead comes up and tells you what you want to know. But for Odin hanging on a tree for this sort of knowledge, it feels like that ritual has been altered, because to get his, in effect, the only person to be there would be Bestla, his giantess mother. To get her to come up would not feel right for this level of mythology. And so that's why sacrificing himself to himself rather than himself to Bestla, that wouldn't connect. And I think that is the story of those two stanzas, that Odin hanging from a tree for 9 nights, an initiation ritual slightly metamorphosized from the standard initiation ritual in Old Norse, but it almost certainly is Odin, even though because of the way it's still on the world tree, but it could easily be applied to other people, and there's no reason why other people maybe didn't go through this process. However, there is one last thing. If this was such an important piece of mythology, and everybody seems to know this piece of mythology, anyone who's sort of vaguely interested, then why didn't Snorri Sturluson, who wrote the prose Edda 50 years after the, I think it was maybe just before the Poetic Edda, why did he not mention this poem or
Good
these
question.
lines?
I thought the same thing, actually. I was looking for that in there. I was wondering it myself. Now, what's up with these runes? What is the purpose of these runes? And is there outside information that we need to know when we're talking about the story of Odin getting these runes?
So when you talk about the runes, we're actually talking here about songs. So the next stanzas say he gets, I think it's about 18 songs, but originally it's probably 9 songs because of the magic 9. And these songs were in effect spells, magic spells, and they allowed him to do things like stop people getting hurt or making women fall in love with him. They're really useful type day-to-day spells. So that's what this really means. The runes are associated with magic. But what we find is that there is certainly within people who are believers of those traditional religions today, they believe the runes hold some magical properties. And so they are, the runes are actually representations of letters of the alphabet we know today, and a representation within sort of Nordic culture. So the Old Norse mythology. So, and there's slightly different versions. So the Anglo-Saxons had a set of runes. The Old Norse went through two sets, had an elder Futhark, they call it, which had more letters in than a younger Futhark, which is more recent. But the younger Futhark was in use in the Viking period, the period we're more interested in. But it really is just their attempt at an alphabet, probably created from people traveling from like the Roman Empire, coming in and saying, oh, this is a good idea to write things down. But we don't ever see runes being used for magic within Old Norse mythology. However, we do see some inference that they may be being used in Tacitus's Germania, where there's mention of sort of sticks being used, thrown, and sort of some ritual being done with those.
And it also has this echo of, like I mentioned before, I was applying Greek philosophy to, and I was saying that Odin's sort of like the logos, but the logos is also defined as the word. So I think him getting the runes makes him sort of a archetype for this logos.
Well,
and, and by the way, Herodotus calling him Mercury, that could be part of the reason why, because Mercury is also called in Egyptian mythology as Thoth, as the logos, is the word. So there seems to be this archetypal thing
exactly.
apply. And
because Hermes was very knowledgeable, wasn't he? One of the most knowledgeable of the gods.
Yeah.
And Odin, that was his whole point.
Of the gods, literally the word of the gods.
Exactly. And Odin, he was all about getting knowledge. So he brought the Sirius up, so he had knowledge of the end of the world. He got the runes. He sacrificed his eyes for Mimir as well to get this liquid so he could understand the prophecy. He the mead of poetry, which was made from the spittle of all the gods, who created a man called Kvasir, who then the dwarves killed. From his blood made the mead, and eventually through a long convoluted story, Odin gets to read things like that. But he gets knowledge of everything. So his life is all about knowledge, but particularly about knowledge so he would survive Ragnarok and continue living. And that's the other thing we haven't really talked about in terms of the poetry, is that Christ, after 3 days, okay, he died, then he rose, but then he died again. Where Odin, getting the runes was the start of his life, in effect.
That's a good point.
So yeah, it's not basically an analogy of Jesus on a cross. It's what I'm trying to say,
No, I get. You explained that very well. Now, does he sort of replace Thor as like the sovereign, or is this just a myth that people? Is this a misconception of people who aren't in that world, who don't understand this world, and who just think that? Is it because it seems to be people think that?
No, no. What you'll find is that people have a weird view of culture at points in history. So people forget that sort of this age of Old Norse mythology lasted about 500 years and was spread between Denmark and Scandinavia, the countries. It was influenced from Germany, and so things change all the time. What people believed in Denmark at 500 CE was different to what people believed in Norway at 1000 CE. Yeah, and you
see the same type of dichotomy happening in ancient Greece, where the pantheon in Athens, the way they worship, the way the playwriters in Athens, Dionysus, Athena, is way different than when you go to Phrygia, and they got Attis, they have Artemis, all these different gods. But our Western minds in the future, we think of it all as one big story. But no,
all at the same time, but it isn't.
Yeah,
and this is what happens here. So Thor, I say, was without doubt the most popular of the gods. Odin was more popular in some places than Thor, but not so much. Tyr, we talk about Tyr, is hardly mentioned at all. More in sort of Germany and Denmark than Sweden or Norway, and certainly not in Iceland. So yeah, it changes. There is no sort of definite answer unless you give me a exact time of, in the calendar and the place. Only then can we give you a specific answer. But Odin was tended to be more the king type god. Thor was the warrior type god, and considering there were more warriors than kings and jarls, then Thor was more popular.
That makes sense. Sort of like how in the Roman Empire, Sol Invictus becomes, for a period of time, like I would say like from 2nd century till the time of Constantine, Sol Invictus becomes the biggest, most popular god. And it's like, how is Sol Invictus more popular than Jupiter or Zeus? Well, because all these soldiers, Romans are always at war with the Parthians or whoever, and all the soldiers love this god for some reason, and they identify with him, and that's what it is. So there's always a cultural aspect when you have to look at this stuff.
Exactly, and we see that, and that's where you see the build-up of gods like Woden. So Woden's background, who turned into Odin, to a fair degree, isn't a direct transformation. I mean, Woden not only has influence from the Wild Hunt and the Wothu, which we touched on, but he also has influence from Mercury, but from Mithras, from Luna, the Vedic. You see all these influences everywhere from people traveling and seeing these things and their experiences and the stories they tell. They all build up and create this god who, it just seems like the god of everything almost.
Yeah, that's what happens. You're right. This has been great, and we're definitely gonna do this again soon.
Cool.
And if anyone needs if you have any links that you want to lead everyone to while we're on the subject,
well, go to my channel, Crecganford on YouTube. I talk about many of these things that I've spoken about today, although they're often hidden within other stories. But my whole premise is I try and tell you the stories behind the stories you know. So you may know a story, but I try and tell you the things that are happening to make that story into the shape you're aware of. That's my aim as an academic.
And everyone, the links in the description for the YouTube channel Crecganford, and you will just attain true Gnosis.
You have just attained true Gnosis. The Demiurge has no power over you.